What up, fam? Welcome back to 88-Bit Tech. I'm AJ. Happy New Year. And what better way to start off the new year by taking a look at a blast from the past. At the end of last year, I got this free PC off of a recommendation from a previous customer of mine. He recommended one of his friends to get in contact with me to help him build a PC. I was more than happy to talk to him about him wanting to upgrade his system. And he's been out of the game for a while, and I love talking tech, so I didn't mind it at all. And towards the end of the year, he ended up building that PC that I recommended, and as a thank you, he gifted me this PC. Shout out to Brent, thank you for the recommendation, and shout out to Christian for giving me his old PC. So let's run down the specs. It came with an i7-4790K that I have overclocked to 4.4 gigahertz for this. For the benchmarks that we're going to be running at 1080p. It's on an MSI Z97 Gaming 7 motherboard. This is a full ATX motherboard with an M.2 slot. The CPU is being cooled by an NZXT Kraken X62 280mm AIO, and it has 16 gigabytes of DDR3 RAM running at 1600 megatransfers per second in a 4x4 configuration. They're G.Skill Ripjaws. It also came with a 650 watt Corsair VS650 80 plus white power supply with dual 8-pin connectors. All of this was in the NZXT S340 mid-tower white case, and it was a bit of work. This thing was caked in dust, so it did take quite a long time, couple hours for me to clean it top to bottom, but now it's essentially like new, and we're gonna go ahead and get to testing it. The components that I did have to add were an XFX RX 580 8GB overclocked edition. So this is not a cut down slim version one that I get from AliExpress, but a full RX 580. As for the storage, I threw in a 512GB XrayDisk Pro M.2 NVMe SSD. Now this board doesn't support Gen 3 speeds. It only goes up to a maximum of 1000 megabits per second, which is still really fast, and you're gonna be loading games very quickly still on this system. So everything is on that, including the OS. You're gonna have a really fast boot with this M.2 NVMe SSD. I also threw in a Fenvi Wifi and Bluetooth card. So we're going to be running this test on a bunch of different games at 1080p. Let's see how this combination can play games in 2025.
Before we get into the results of these benchmarks, I should mention that I don't have a video capture card, so all of this footage is captured on the same computer using AMD Relive. So performance in these games is going to take a little bit of a hit, and sometimes it's going to be greater in some games as opposed to others, but overall it's going to be relatively close to the performance that you see on screen. First up, we have Baldur's Gate 3, an amazing game, and I'm pretty sure it won Game of the Year in 2024. Or at least got nominated for it. But with this game at medium settings, I believe I had it set to medium settings at 1080p, no upscaling. We did average at about 60 frames per second with a 1% low of about 35. For CS2, we ran this at the high preset at 1080p, and we got 100 average FPS with a 1% low of 63. For Cyberpunk 2077, let's get into the settings here. You can see we've got it set to AMD FSR3, set to quality with frame generation enabled, and the high preset. And we are, of course, running in 1080p, windowed borderless mode here. At the end of this run, I did end up averaging 78 frames per second, with a 1% low of 37. Remember to keep in mind that I do have AMD Relive running, so the FPS recorded here are a bit lower, so you can expect maybe 2 to 5 more frames per second without it on. But overall, the gameplay felt really smooth despite the frame time graph there. and it would definitely be a more than enjoyable experience with these frame rates. With Forza Horizon 5 at the medium preset, we did get an average of 79 frames per second with a 1% low of 63. This is one of those games where AMD Relive does take a big hit, so you expect to get quite a bit more FPS without it running. But overall, a very smooth experience and definitely more than enjoyable with this combination. Jumping into Ghost of Tsushima at 1080p, exclusive full screen, we do have AMD FSR3 on, and it's set to quality with AMD FSR3 frame generation running. Graphic wise, we have it set to the lowest setting, or the low preset, and we get an average of, we get a locked 60 frame per second experience and a 1% low of 60 frames per second as well. Reason for this is I am actually locking the frames to 60 using RTSS software, and you kind of have to do this with this game, otherwise you get really bad lag spikes and frame pacing issues in this particular title. However, if you lock it at that 60, you do get a locked 60 FPS experience, and it is pretty nice. For Grand Theft Auto 5, we have it set to 1080p, high settings all around, post effects is set to normal, and advanced graphics are set to off, and we get a pretty high frame rate experience that is quite smooth, with an average of 96 frames per second and a 1% low of 53. Alright, so for Helldivers 2, we have field of view set to max, resolution scale is 1080p, frame rate limit is off, and display mode, let's set that to full screen to get the most frames possible. Graphics wise, we're running custom settings, motion blur 33%. I do turn off all those other features. Texture quality, since we are running an 8GB card, I have that set to high, but everything else is set to low, although I do turn on anti-aliasing to smooth out some of those edges.
This is it. This is the solemn duty for which you were born. Defend democracy at any cost. Deploying equipment package.
AMD Relive does hit Helldivers 2 pretty hard, so I would say you probably will average close to 60 FPS with this, and a 1% low of around 44 frames per second. Moving on to Hogwarts Legacy, we have the global preset set to low on everything, and the display settings, we do have Windows full screen. FSR 2 is enabled, set to quality, uncapped frames, field of view at max, and everything else off. After running around Hogwarts, Hogsmeade, and around the castle in the outskirts as well, I averaged 73 frames per second with a 1% low of 28. Like I said, you will get a bit more higher frames without AMD Relive running. For Red Dead Redemption 2, this combination actually fares really well. Running it at the lowest balanced preset, we do get some really smooth gameplay, averaging 69 FPS with a 1% low of 54. And that is with AMD Relive running, so expect to see higher frames without it. Moving on to Warhammer Space Marine 2, probably one of the more difficult titles to run, and one of the newer ones in my benchmark test here. And we have the settings all set to low, although we do have the textures set to high because of the 8GB on the RX 580 8GB. We also have FSR 3 enabled, set to balance, with frame generation enabled. And with that, we do end up getting a really smooth and high refresh rate experience, averaging 83 FPS with a 1% low of 48. On to the next game, we have Starfield, another very intensive game to run. We are able to get a 60 FPS experience and it not look too bad. We have all the settings set to low, and we are running FSR 3, frame generation enabled, set to quality, so that's 67% render scale resolution. Like I said, we are getting a 60% or a 60 average FPS with a 1% low of around 22. This will be a bit higher with AMD Relive off, and this is one of the more intensive parts of the game here in New Atlantis, so you should experience higher frames elsewhere in the game. But still, not too bad, and definitely playable with this aging combination. And last but not least, we have The Witcher 3. We are running this game on the high preset with FSR 2, so it's set to quality, and dynamic resolution scaling off. AMD cards tend to fare really well with The Witcher 3, and this is no exception. With the RX 580, we are able to achieve 70 average FPS with a 1% low of 40 FPS with AMD Relive running. This is a really good result considering that we are running this on some pretty ancient software. However, it is more than playable, and this would and looks great as well.